Hello everyone, welcome to Payment Tech Media. In this video, we will talk about the differences between private and public IP addresses and how can we tell if this is a private IP address or public IP address and what are the differences between them. So let's jump into my computer and have a look. So in IP version 4, we have private IP addresses and public IP addresses. So these private IP addresses, we don't need to pay for. We don't need to purchase. We can use it on a local area network. In other words, private IP addresses, they are not routable. They are only for internal communications. Always I give this example. Let's say at home, we have, if this is the home, for example, and let's say our internet network connection here, and if this is our router, which again router connects dissimilar networks together, right? It reroutes the packets. Layer 3 device in the OSI model, we will talk about it more later on. It connects different network together. So if this is our router and this is the interface that connects to the ISP, and here all the connections internally we have for our equipments at home, if this is wired or wireless. So let's say at home you have 7-8 different devices connecting to the network. Now if I ask a question, are you paying 7-8 different internet connections? No, you are just paying one, correct? So this IP address that you see, this known as your public IP address, and all these IP addresses internally known as your private IP addresses. And these private IP addresses, where they're coming from, routers, they do have built-in DHCP services that provides these IP addresses. So earlier I talked about the private IP addresses, they're not routable. Therefore, how can we connect to the internet using our private IP addresses? Again, it's another service in the router known as NAT, Network Address Translation. When we talk about network address, what are we talking about? IP address, right? That's a network address. Translation, it translates from private to public IP address. So router can connect us to the outside network. And if this is our internet service provider going through the service provider connecting to a destination web server or destination network. So all these IP addresses internally we are using, known as private IP addresses. This IP address here that we are paying, it's leasing from our ISP. We're paying monthly bill. That's our public IP address. And remember, these internal private IP addresses could be dynamically assigned, as I talked about, built-in DHCP server, dynamic host configuration protocol, assigning these IP addresses to these devices, or manually we can assign, which is known as a static IP address, going to each device and specifically manually assigning IP address. When we are assigning IP addresses manually, we need to be careful with the IP addressing scheme not to cause any IP duplicate, all that. Now, same thing applies for our public IP address. Public IP address could be dynamically or static. Usually businesses, they pay more for their public IP address. You know how when we contact ISP and asking for we need internet connections, and they might ask if this is for residential or business use, and if we want to, let's say for business, most likely they ask if you want static IP address or dynamic, because dynamic IP address might change. Static, always it will be assigned to you. So remember, the public IP address is the only IP address that you are paying for. The private IP addresses, they are free, you can use it internally. And this private public creates multi-tier to reserve kind of IP addressing. So for example, if we take a look for one of a class C IP address, let's say here, this device, class C IP address 192.168.1. Let's say 18. So this IP address, it's a private IP address, and let's say if it was assigned to this device. So how do we know this is private IP address? Here, as we can see, for class C, private IP address range goes from 192.168.0.0 to 192.168.255.255. So let's say 192.168.1.18, one of the IP addresses, private IP address we are using here for this device. So we have to keep in mind we cannot use this IP address again in this network because it's already in use. If we are using the same IP address for another device, causes IP duplicate. But in another network, let's say another network, we might see 192.168 192.168.1.18. So these private IP addresses known as being locally significant. So this 192.168.1.18, it's in this network and it has to be unique. So this 192.168.1.18 IP address, it's unique in this network. Therefore, this does not cause IP duplicate. Why? Because remember, only your public IP address. So here, if this was the public IP address, these public IP addresses has to be unique globally, which you received it through your internet service provider. For example, let's say if this is a Google website, going to google.com, this google.com has no idea about these private IP addresses. It knows your public IP address. So when you request it to access the Google website, the response goes back to your public IP address. And then on your router, port address translation, it translates the public to the private and it says, oh, this device requested earlier, so it responds back to this device, which in other videos we will talk about a lot more in detail. So just keep in mind regarding these private and public IP addresses when we talk about IP version 4. For the private IP addresses, you don't need to pay, they are free and they are only locally significant. It has to be unique in a local area network. And accessing internet through a router public IP address we received from ISP. Now if we had another network, for example here on this local area connection, and we wanted to connect, let's say if this network it was for class B network, for example this device, the IP address was 172.16.25.7. So this is another example of private IP address 172.16.25.7. And now if this device wants to communicate to this device at this location, has to go through the router because they are different class, different network. And same thing, if this device wants to access the internet, has to go through the router and accessing the internet. So in this example, this router, we have 3 different interfaces. One of them, let's say, connecting to the internet. One network is for the 172.16.00 network, and this network is 192.168.1.0 network. And if we had a switch with multi-port or wireless connection, and here we had switch for multi-port and connecting devices. So accessing from internal network to the internet using NAT, network address translation, converts private IP address to the public IP address, and only the destination knows about your public IP address. Therefore, the response comes back to the public IP address. And then same thing, rather, the port address translation translates the public IP address to the private IP address. It comes back to the device. So this is a quick overview of private and public IP addresses. Just remember in class A, the range for private IP addresses 10.0.0.0 and it goes to 10.255.255.255. And the default subnet mask for class A, we talked about it previously, is 255.0.0.0. The private IP address range for class B here, as we can see, and the default subnet mask. For class C, as we can see here, and the default subnet mask. So any of these IP addresses we use, we don't need to pay for. They are known as private IP addresses and only reserved for the private use for the intranet communications, internal networking communications. Imagine if we hadn't this private IP addressing scheme, and if all of them had to be public, basically per device, we had to pay intranet connection. And that would be very, very expensive. Now we only pay one internet connection, that's a public IP address, and internally we use all the private IP addressing which we talked about. It could be dynamically assigned from the DHCP, the built-in services, to the routers, or manually we can go to the TCP/IP settings of the devices or computers and assigning IP addresses manually. When we assign IP addresses manually, we have to be careful with the classes and being on the same network or being part of the same subnet, and assigning the correct default gateway address so it can access the internet. So just keep in mind, in IP version 4, we do have a private IP address and public IP address. For the private IP address, we don't need to pay for, and the private IP addresses are mainly used for local area network, internal networking communications. And the public IP addresses are the IP addresses that we have to pay for. It's registered, we receive it from our internet service provider or network service providers, and they are routable. So you might say, well, at home we have multiple devices, they are using private IP address, how can they access the internet? So quick recap, they are using NAT, network address translation. What network address are we talking about? IP address. So it's basically in the router, services provide NAT, which can convert internal private IP address into the public IP address and makes it routable. So destination servers, they have no idea about your private IP address. They only understand your public IP address. So response back to your public IP address, and your router again convert based on port address translation to the appropriate computer was requesting for this connection. So to see our private IP address, we just simply open up command prompt, start cmd, and then type ipconfig to see all the information, physical address, IP address, DNS, default gateway, everything. So we type ipconfig space /all. For Unix and Linux devices, we type ifconfig. So now you might say, how can we tell or how can we find out our public IP address? For the public IP address, we just Google. We open up the browser and type what is my IP address and Google what is my IP address. And there are different websites like IPChicken and so on. Then you can look up, type what is my IP address, and it tells you your public IP address. So that's mainly the differences between private and public IP address. I hope this video was helpful. If you like the video, please hit the thumbs up. If you want to see more tech videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. And if you have any question, leave it in the comment section. And stay tuned for the next videos. We will talk about subnetting, supernetting, and a lot more exercises in IPversion 4. Thank you so much for watching and have a good day.